Welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Let's give it another second as people are joining. You're here today. You're here from risk to readiness, future-proofing businesses against water supply disruptions. It's great to see everybody today. So welcome again to From Risk to Readiness, Future-Proofing Businesses Against Water Supply Disruptions. I'm Evan Jonette. By day, I work for Market Operator Services, helping to ensure that the water retail market runs smoothly. And in my volunteer time, I'm a member of Institute of Water's Midlands Committee. Through iWater, I've been very lucky to work with Water Direct in the past on webinars on water emergencies. I think we ran the last one a year ago, and it was extremely popular. So I'm very keen to hear from Water Direct and our other experts again today about this very important topic. We've got three great speakers today. For those of us working in the water sector, we know that there are risks, but many businesses don't see water as a key utility. They assume the taps will always run, right? But some of us know that's not the case. Organizations do invest heavily in cyber threats, power failures, supply chain disruptions, but are we overlooking water? We need to make sure that we change that mindset and that we are prepared for water resilience issues in the future. So today we will explore the growing risk businesses face from water supply interruptions, the real world impacts that come when those outages affect operations, and what preventative strategies we can employ to make sure that we safeguard water continuity. Our speakers today will guide us through those issues. They'll give us some practical insights and some real world examples. We've got three speakers today. We've got Liz Darcy. She's one of my colleagues from MOSL, and she'll start with a macro view. What do we know about how risky water supplies are these days? What is affecting supply networks? Where's the increasing demand coming from? MOSL's got a very specific view on the non-household segment, so you'll hear from Liz to start. We'll then move to Chris Falconer from Water Direct with a follow-up on organizational views, what Water Direct sees as business impact and how to avoid or mitigate incidents where the water stops flowing. Chris will tell us what interruptions can cost businesses. And finally, we'll hear from Milind Patel from HydroX Group, who's been party to some eyebrow-raising case studies. Milind will share a practical view of those hard lessons learned by businesses about resilience when they faced supply failures. Milind hopefully will leave us with some ideas for our own contingency plans. We'll counter through our speakers pretty quickly, and we'll ask them afterwards to be part of a Q&A panel. So do please save your questions until the end. There is a questions tab in this live Storm facility. So please use that questions tab. So we'll see your questions come in. We won't necessarily be looking at the chat. So please use the questions. And also you'll only hear the speakers speak. So you won't be able to verbally ask your questions. So do put it in the chat and we'll get to it at the end. So we'll start with Liz. We'll hear from Liz from MOSL on how fragile our networks actually are and where the risks to the water supply in the non-household market are coming from. So over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Evan, and welcome everyone. Great to be here. So yeah, I've got about 10 minutes to highlight some of the growing risks from non-household water users, using the data and publicly available dashboards that MOSL has developed around the business retail market. So next slide, please, Carolyn. So just a bit of background, the business retail market opened in 2017, allowing non-household customers like businesses, charities and local government to choose their water retailers. And MOSL, as the market operator, is responsible for running the market systems, overseeing the market codes and ensuring the market evolves for the benefit of end customers. And we've also got oversight of the market data across England and Wales. Next slide, please, Caroline. Thanks. So what does the market data show us at a high level? We can see there are 1.2 million non-household customers consuming around 3,000 megalitres per day, or around 30% of the total public water consumed. But within this customer base at supply point level, there is a huge diversity of water consumption. And this makes sense when you consider that business customers can range from hairdressers to oil refineries. So we can see that 86% of business supply points have relatively low levels of consumption, and that many of these use water in exactly the same way as domestic customers for taps and toilets. But a small number, or around 13,000 customers, consume over 50% of the water going through the market. So the business retail market represents a significant but also a very diverse group of customers for the water industry, and they're increasingly becoming a focus with demand reduction targets. So what can this high-level data tell us about risk and readiness? Next slide, please. So I'd like to look at risk and readiness with the standard risk equation and look at a number of different elements. So the type of risk, the likelihood it will happen, and the impact if it occurs, and of course any mitigation in place to minimise the chance of a risk occurring or the impact if it does. So let's have a look at these elements in turn in relation to the data that we've got in the business retail market. Thanks, Caroline. Next slide. Thank you. So I'd like to draw out the different types of risk, and particularly two different types of risks that might bring some of this to light. So I guess the first on the kind of left-hand side is the risk type from immediate, acute but short-term asset failure type risks. And these could result in boil notices or complete disconnections, typically kind of impacting quite localized populations for short periods of time. And the market has a view of these as wholesalers and retailers need to work together. So wholesalers need to notify retailers when any of these kind of incidents occur. And they range in severity from level 1 being the most severe to level 3. And since June 2024, when we had this data available, we can see that there's been 49 of the most severe notifications, 45 of the second most severe, and over 10,000 of the least severe level 3 notifications that the wholesalers have sent retailers, kind of flagging that there's either a water or a sewerage impact. And this very much aligns with the sort of data that's produced openly by the water industry, focusing on the most serious incidents. And we can see that the latest figures for these serious events show that there were 75 in 2024, which was an increase on the 2023 figure of 47. So potentially we can infer that maybe those are slightly increasing. There's also on the kind of right-hand side of this slide, the type of risk from kind of longer duration, more extensive, like weather-related events. And due to the exceptionally dry weather this year, we've seen this kind of happen this year with drought restrictions being implemented by many water companies. So the drought restriction map shown on the right, which is available on the MOSL website publicly, shows a national view of current drought restrictions across England and Wales. And restrictions kind of ramp up from voluntary restrictions through to kind of temporary use bans or hosepipe bans. And kind of, although we haven't kind of hit this level yet, I think this year there has been an increased risk of non-essential use bans in some areas. But currently 16% of non-household connections, or 220,000 water supply points, are located in areas with temporary use bans. And I think as weather patterns change with climate change, the likelihood of drought restrictions kind of being implemented is likely to increase. Next slide, please, Carolyn. So another element to consider when assessing risk is likelihood, and to understand this kind of at a macro level, we can look at the water deficits from the water resource management plans that wholesalers need to submit every 5 years. And overall, these indicate without action, there will be a 4 billion megalitres per day shortfall. Sorry, a 4,000 billion litres per day shortfall by 2050. But we've looked at this more in the kind of realistic timescale of 2030, which is the end of the AMP. And working with the Environment Agency, we've taken some of the data submitted as part of the plans and developed some water balance categories, showing the baseline view. So this is the view that is without action, so before wholesalers implement their plans, but it does give an indication of the risk. And this shows that 83% of non-household supply points are located in areas of deficit, and that is 43% in areas of high deficit. And this has increased since the last submission in 2019, which showed just 33% of connections were located within water deficits. But this very much varies across the country. And again, you can see this on the publicly available MOSL dashboard and map, and, you know, get a view of kind of areas and risk. Thank you. So next slide, Carolyn. I just want to briefly touch on the different impacts of no water. Obviously, our next speakers will talk in a lot more detail about this, but it's worth flagging that not all business customers are impacted by the same event in the same way. So I mentioned temporary use bans. These just impact household or domestic customers. And even if drought restrictions move to non-essential use bans, only certain sectors using water in specific ways would be impacted. It's also worth flagging that sensitive customers are flagged in the market. So certain types of business customers have more of a kind of impact. If they had to turn off, there would be more of an impact on the wider economy or society. So they are flagged, and we can see that just under 4% of premises in the non-household market are flagged as sensitive. But it's worth also saying that these are just the top level sensitive customers. They don't include national critical infrastructure such as data centres, which have been recently categorised as national critical infrastructure, and they don't flag sites with animals, which potentially, you know, could need kind of additional consideration. So yeah, there's a great deal of variety in terms of impact. So next slide, please, Carolyn. But it's worth also flagging that the impact isn't just direct. I think indirect impact needs to be considered by all businesses in terms of reputational risk. So water is increasingly needed to support growth and meet the government's growth agenda around economic growth and house building. It's needed to allow transition to net zero, and increasingly we're seeing that water is the limiting factor in some growth, and there are currently moratoriums in some areas that prevent non-household connections connecting with the supply. So we can see that increasingly water is you know, having a potential impact on economic growth, and there's potentially a reputational risk for businesses of not using water responsibly. So what can businesses do? risk can be minimised through mitigation, and again, Chris and Millen have a lot more detail on this than me. In terms of the market, we've got a view on business continuity plans for sensitive customers, and we can see that kind of this flag has been activated for less than 1% of sites, but that might just be that flag doesn't cover all the business continuity plans that are out there. I think the main kind of point is that that flag really shows that there is support from the water industry in supporting businesses in kind of thinking about their business continuity plans, and you know, the water companies are happy to support businesses in coming up with some of those plans. Next slide, please. The other thing to note is, as well as the short-term planning being a necessary first step, there are additional options that businesses could consider when considering long-term resilience. And we've done a little bit of high-level analysis on the industry segments within the market to infer potential for different sectors to use non-potable supplies. And we see the non-potable sort of usage as being ideal candidates for moving to alternative sources of supply. So using the sector data that we have, we estimate that around 70,000 supply points, or 17% of the water in the non-household market, could actually consider using non-potable water sources. So there's an opportunity to potentially take the strain off the public network and move to alternative sources, such as the sources identified on the right, in the table on the right. Thank you. Next slide, please, Carolyn. And I'd also like to flag the opportunity with smart metering. So as you're probably aware, water companies across England are investing £1.2 billion to install an additional 10 million smart meters, and this includes nearly 800,000 business customers. And the goal is to have 66% of non-households meters smart by 2030. So smart meters really provide hourly data, helping to understand site level usage patterns, and they can identify continuous flow or wastage, and allow the development of incentives like tariffs to minimise peak demand. And all of this will help optimise supply demand and minimise the pressure on the network, so reducing the chance of no water events. So currently 10% of non-household meters are smart, but this really varies geographically. And the MOSL smart meter maps, again, that are publicly available, show the current distribution of smart meters and when smart metering is due by postal sector. So it's definitely worth having a look at those to see where your area is due to go smart. And it's also worth flagging that, you know, different retailers offer different services and have different approaches. So it's worth considering and speaking to the different retailers to see what services they can offer to help businesses mitigate and in the longer term. Thank you. Next slide, please, Carolyn. So in summary, no water risks exist now, from the drought restrictions this summer to kind of moratoriums on non-household connections. The likelihood of no water events are increasing due to climate change, population growth, and transition to net zero. And non-household customers are directly impacted by no water events, although this varies by customer type. But I think the message is that everyone needs to consider both the direct and indirect risks of using water irresponsibly, And this can really kind of impact wider society and the economy. And there's lots that can be done to mitigate this, especially as the water industry rolls out smart meters. So yeah, take a look at the publicly available dashboards and use them as tools to help you understand risks and how the water industry can support. Thank you. Back to you, Evan.
Thank you, Liz. That was really interesting. I'm sure a lot of our viewers of this webinar didn't realize that there was an organization that had oversight of water-stressed areas, and we can map those directly to non-household customers. I didn't realize there were up to 10,000 minor disruptions. That's a bit scary, and it sounds like you're saying there's a lot of sensitive sites we might not even know about who may be at risk. So I think that's a great transition to Chris from Water Direct. Chris will build on Liz's overview of the risks. Hopefully, Chris will take us from the risks to the impact. What does supply disruptions actually mean, Chris, for business operations? Do you know what the financial and reputation costs are? And is there any way to plan and procure alternative water supplies to mitigate these interruptions? So over to you.
Sure, thanks, Evan. I couldn't have said it better myself. So before I begin, I just wanted to, for those of you on the call that might not be familiar with Water Direct, just give you a little bit of a background to who we are as an organisation. So the company's actually been around for just under 30 years now, and we are the UK's leading alternative water supplier. We operate nationwide 24/7, 365 days of the year, and that goes from anywhere from rapid emergency response to planned water continuity. We work with all of the water companies within England and Wales, as well as a number of critical infrastructure providers, as well as across the broad breadth of commercial sectors. Now, I don't need to tell anybody on this call how important and critical water is as a utility for any type of sector. Ultimately, even short-term interruptions can cause significant operational, reputational, financial impacts. Yet, I think that the surprising thing, and we've said it a number of times in this webinar so far, is that it's ultimately overlooked, especially when you compare it to the amount of attention that's given to other utilities like power, like IT, communications. Water's just not given that level of airtime. 46% of large organisations and 39% of SMEs have disclosed that they have faced some sort of major water disruption in the last 12 months. But despite that, 66% of those large businesses and 89% of SMEs don't have any form of water continuity plan ready available in those events. And why is that? Ultimately, there's a number of answers to that question. But most commonly, it's the case that water is just assumed to be guaranteed. And as most of us will know, that's not always the case. So what does this mean in reality when there is an interruption? It varies. Ultimately, the impacts will notably change depending upon what sector that you look at, what industry you look at, company that you look at. But just to give you a bit of a range of the examples, you take from a healthcare perspective, if a hospital doesn't have access to water, then ultimately they're not going to be able to maintain patient safety, whether that be from a hygiene or sanitation perspective. And then you take it all the way to the other end of the extreme case, then you could have a retail store, for example, that has no ability to be able to provide any domestic water usage for those that work for it. So ultimately would need to close for that day and then lose a day worth of trading because of it. So it's estimated that for every 24 hours worth of a supply outages, businesses will expect to lose, on average, either 20% of their sales for that day or 20% of their production volumes that would normally occur during that day. And this loss can come from multiple different sources. So, from a purist perspective, there could be, the loss of revenue, and that is estimated to be anywhere between £2,000 to £50,000 per hour, depending on what the industry that you're looking at. With some of those more extreme water users, such as data centres, that figure of loss can be much higher. You have the BCC that suggests that SMEs could lose £10,000 in lost revenue per day due to water supply failures. And then if you think about food processing plants, the more heavy manufacturing side, actually those losses can exceed millions of pounds per day. But it's not just the basic kind of revenue side of things. Certain companies and industries will be more subject to fines and penalties for the loss of output. So, for example, housing associations might end up with contractual penalties for not being able to provide their residents, or you might have people that look after, say, army barracks and the inhabitants of those. So what you'll find is not only is there a revenue impact there, but that's also compounded by potential fines and penalties that then can come on top. And then if you think, Liz mentioned earlier on, you've got the hidden cost that's associated with unplanned downtime. So that could be productivity, that could be your liabilities further on down your supply chain for not making fulfilling the commitments that you made previously. And those damages can often exceed the more revenue-based or the penalty-based by 30 to 50%. Of course, we're not just talking about financial impacts here. Quite clearly, there's reputational impacts of not being able to sustain your normal BAU operation due to the water going off. But then there might also be regulatory consequences, and they can come in a number of different guises. But if you think about sanitary conditions, if you think about fire suppressions, very quickly you can find yourself in a situation where there's subsequent action taken by the likes of the Environment Agency or the Care Quality Commission. So the golden question, how do you build resilience? What are the key steps that you need to be able to do to be able to safeguard yourself against these issues? Well, the first stage ultimately is understanding your risk. And how do you understand your risk? By carrying out an audit of what your water use actually is. So, mapping your usage across your site. What do you use and how does it flow across that site becomes the first key thing to undertake. Once you have that in place, you can then start to identify your vulnerabilities. So what are the critical parts there that are potentially putting you at risk? Once you understand your risks, you can understand what the impact is. Actually stopping to think, what would a day worth of lost trading be to us if we were to lose our water supply? How much backup do we have? What would it actually mean for us in whatever language is most important to that company? Whether that be customer reputation or whether that be financial pounds and pence. Then once you've got that logged, it's a case of monitoring. It's an evolving picture where it comes to water. Ultimately, your infrastructure might change. The people that work within the business, what you do changes. So making sure that this is something that becomes a cyclical exercise. Ooh. So you understand your risk. You can then put your plan in place. The first stage of that will be introducing preventative measures. So that could include things like putting in a inspection and maintenance routine of all of your water systems. It could be installing mobile or temporary water solutions for water critical areas. It could be quality testing. It could be developing an internal process so that actually your teams know what to do on the back of a water interruption. Once you've got your preventative measures in place, that's then when you need to move on to, okay, so let's go to worst case scenario and they fail. And you aren't able to sustain your supply with your preventative measures. That's where an AWS strategy comes in, so your alternate water supply strategy. So who will you contact? What are the supply methods that you would use? How appropriate are they for your buildings? And I'll come back onto that topic in a second. And then finally, once you've got a plan, you need to test it. It's no good a plan sat on a shelf gathering dust that you never pick up, and then all of a sudden you have an interruption, everything's going the wrong way, and then you don't know what to do. So making sure that actually that plan works in reality, that it's tested and tested regularly with the people that within the organisation is the key to make sure that it actually succeeds. So when it comes to AWS strategies, there's normally three core approaches that you can take. The first one could be via tankering. So that's the bulk movement of water to either replenish on-site storage, or it might even be to do network injections, where you would tap into the individual distribution network and then thereby everything downstream doesn't know the water goes off. It could be through bottled water. So if you have a population within your business which is more for domestic water usage, you could deliver pallets of bottled water there to be able to provide a temporary fix while the mains potable supply is being re-established. Or one that's in between could be actually, if you know your water is going to be out for a few days, the establishment of a static tank, which can go up to whatever size your business needs to be able to sustain its usage, with a dedicated pumping system. Now, the question that's always asked is, can you get the tangible benefit out of investment in these kind of three kind of core areas of strategy? And ultimately, in nearly every single case, the answer is yes, you can. From a more general perspective, by being on top of your AWS strategy, you have a diversification of water supply sources. You have built-in redundancy and risk mitigation. You have emergency preparedness, improved business resilience. But arguably the most compelling answer normally is your financial return on investment. So on average, the cost of water risks related to business interruptions is 5 times greater than the cost of taking actions to prevent them now. If we applied that to taking like the construction sector as an example, on average in the construction sector, a water supply disruption can cost £20,000 to £50,000 worth of lost productivity per day. If you were to look at a entry-level AWS response that you put in place, which might have assets coming to you on a 24-hour basis, for example, that would cost circa £15,000 per year. For that investment, you end up with no lost downtime, the recovery of a safe and compliant operation as quickly as you possibly can, and then no knock-on effects to what can be a very project-orientated and milestone-orientated sector. The story is very similar in the manufacturing space, albeit the costs are somewhat higher. So in manufacturing, on average, you can lose up to £100,000 to £200,000 per day. So the AWS solution that gets put in place there tends to be a little bit more robust and a lot quicker. So rather than being, say, a 24-hour response, you tend to work to a 12-hour response that you might have bottled water turning up, tankers turning up. So you're looking at investment around more the £20,000 a year mark. Again, in return for that, it's sustaining critical activities which might be associated with cooling or cleaning, through various different types of manufacturing process. Production schedules are then kept to, and then you're able to avoid those kind of reputational damage from failure to deliver as promised. And then from a final perspective, from a data center side of things, data center arguably is probably one of the biggest impacted by water loss, mainly due to the cooling of servers. But you're looking at anywhere between £6,000 to £9,000 lost per minute for every time that the data center goes down. So again, you compare that kind of financial loss to what is probably a more extreme response AWS strategy that would cost you around £35,000 to develop. And again, being able to keep those systems going, avoiding the asset failures and avoiding the contractual penalties make it a bit of a no-brainer scenario. So what we often find is, regardless of which sector that you're looking at, the return on investment on a robust AWS strategy often speaks for itself. So just to conclude then, a couple of key messages. Ultimately, supply failures can cause extensive damage in a number of different ways, and I think that's quite clear. But proactive planning limits the impacts, and it ultimately can provide very quick return on investment, both financially and reputationally. The key thing being, though, is that ultimately there's no one-size-fits-all approach to alternate water strategies. Ensuring that you have a data-driven approach to it and making sure that you take the time to understand how you use water and how it moves across your business is arguably one of the best ways to make sure that you have a tailored plan that people understand that in the event of an interruption, you're able to respond. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Just to remind people, there are some questions coming in. Please keep them coming in the chat. I'll relay them back to the speakers for the panel after. Chris, I'm taken away from that we haven't maybe sounded the alarm bell as much as we should have around kind of water supply, the same way you have for kind of river pollution. Your figures are suggesting to me a lot of businesses wouldn't even know who to call for alternative water. So thanks for sharing that. It's definitely food for thought. What will it take for businesses to take notice is my question. We'll move on to Milind, who has some examples of what it did take for businesses to take notice, and hopefully doesn't scare us too much with some of these. But Millen, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Next slide, please. So I work for HydroX Group, and we look at water through the built environment, looking at hygiene, treatment, but then also conserving water for application. So we have an in-depth review of a number of sectors, and the purpose of my session is to give what organizations are actually doing and how they're thinking differently, and showing how businesses are responding at an organizational level. And these are lived experiences and lessons directly learned from UK businesses. Next slide, please. So Chris mentioned data centers, and I believe with data centers, the DC engineers, the designers, are engineering for nines for uptime. Cooling water is often the unengineered dependency. So it's very important that you know your minimal viable flow per litre, per rack, per hall, per fit out. So examples would be to install BS 8551 connections or contract a response time before summer, not during it. And data centers are being operated and continue to be constructed in clusters or region where there's a guaranteed power supply or backup generators on site. However, water infrastructure remains the same for the clusters. So how can we adapt? And with this, it's the strategies of understanding internally how much water you will be using at peak times. So next slide, please. So another sector that we are working in is the healthcare as a clinical risk. So the NHS requires 24/7 contingency. And I've experienced where hospitals and even sterile services within the hospitals have had to stop mid-cycle because no one knew where the tanker could connect. And this wasn't downtime, it was patient safety and emergency. And in healthcare, if you haven't rehearsed the tanker access, the switchover and post-event sampling, you don't have a resilience, and it's, I hope, isn't a plan. So the lessons learned with this is definitely start embedding AWS into the HTM risk assessments for water supply, but then also understanding when water is provided in an emergency, that it's suitable and it's been assessed correctly, so there's no further downstream impact. So I strongly recommend, if you are part of a water safety group within a hospital, AE, or part of the estates engineering department, have this roundtable discussion in regards to how this strategy can be implemented safely within the healthcare sectors. Next slide, please. The food and beverage side of things, water isn't just the ingredient, it's the product. And I've seen bottling plants sit idle with tanks full of contingency water arriving at the gate, and it's not been able to be used because of turbidity or chlorine specs weren't met. So with AWS, you could actually be very specific with the style and quality of water that's required for your application. Water isn't just water, and every water has its own unique chemistry and microbiological loading. So this is important to establish the style of water as part of your AWS contingency that is fit for purpose for your application. So lessons are validating the water quality, so it's precise and no further prolonged treatment is required on site to keep your production going. And what I have seen is a lot of practical steps where possible, where, you know, from food and beverage to healthcare, where they put in buffer tanks, if space allows. However, I have noticed a lot of capex in regards to borehole reviews or upgrading existing boreholes. However, the capex, especially for food and beverage and going back to healthcare, takes time to raise this type of money. So AWS definitely does fit that gap, while the strategy for capex and understanding borehole access is reviewed. So this is just something that can be implemented easily. Next slide, please. So with district energy, this has been emerging quite extensively. And it's not about the volume, it's about the chemistry that comes first. So I've been called to energy projects where boilers that feed huge communities of 1,000 homes plus, where emergency tankers have had to come in to fill the network. And what's happened is it's not been the correct chemistry of water. And this has created a huge ongoing issue that the system could run for about a week, but then the knock-on effect is the scaling and corrosion bills that are followed because the incorrect style of water has been used for the heating and cooling. So as part of the AWS strategy, you can easily specify the style of water, if it's from DI water to softened water, to exactly mimic the chemistry required for the heat and cooling generation that serves our communities. And I think that is very important to understand before you implement the AWS strategy. And this can be implemented easily to understand the correct chemistry before. And these are lessons learned that I've seen with the organizations that we consult with, that having this implemented from the beginning will help these contingency plans when systems do go down, or there is a burst pipe in the network that needs to be repaired and filled immediately. Next slide, please. So from the conversations across the sectors, one thing is clear: most organizations think they're ready until the water stops. The gaps only show themselves in the heat outage. So 6 questions that come directly from these lived experiences that I'd like to share is: definitely know your minimum viable water. Do you actually know the minimum viable water? Not your total demand, but litres per second, and the quality for each production line, hospital ward or data hall. Businesses told us that the restart pain was worse than the outage because they hadn't mapped that MVW. Connections, I know it sounds very simple, but where are your temporary connections? Are they BS 8551 compliant? Time again, I've seen estate managers realize during an outage that no safe connection or safe area for a tanker to be positioned to provide water transfer. Also contracts, understanding these. Many organizations assume a tanker turns up and the solution is fixed. In reality, without defined SLAs and going back to the quality specification of the water that you require for your application, it's a gamble. The tankers have done their job to arrive at your gates. What have you done internally to understand how this water will be transferred over to your application? And also the validation speed. What you see is that how quickly can you validate the water quality and restart safely? And that's an internal discussion that is required all the way from the data centers, healthcare and food, because the outage itself is the delay, but the validation of getting everything up and running, microbiologically sound, chemically sound as the water quality for your application. What do you need to do internally to make sure that smooth transition? And also what's important is buffering. We can't always rely on tankers. They are there within identified SLA call-outs. But what I do see, and where applicable, is some proactive sites are now looking at storage tanks or underground storage tanks that could act that buffer. But I still believe that water recycling for data centers that can take potable water and recycle it a couple of times on site. It's easily done because it is clean water that's only been cycled a few times, so it's not heavily industrial water. So having those mitigation on site definitely does help. And in the times of emergencies, tankers can just really contribute to topping up the water supply, which will be fit for purpose. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to outline with this is the bridging point, the internal roundtable discussion that happens internal with organizations. And this is just what I've heard from boardrooms and conversations with engineering departments, estate departments. And I think it's one of the most overlooked lessons from businesses is that once you have a tanker contract, you could have a 2 to 3 hour SLA, but what happens when that tanker truck arrives? Do your internal teams know where to connect, how to avoid airlocks, who validates the water quality, and how distribution inside your facility is maintained? It's not a £1 million investment, and this is where many of my clients stumble, because they think it's very expensive as a solution, but all it is genuinely a roundtable conversation with your facility estates, your quality operations, finance, all need to sit down together and map a method statement, what happens next when AWS is mobilized. From my experience, many organizations haven't had that discussion, but those who have a clear, confident protocol that turns chaos into resilience. And it doesn't cost a lot of money at all to have these internal discussions. And it doesn't cost a lot of money, and it doesn't take weeks, but it requires everyone with the insight within the organization to create a strong resilience measure that you can put into place. So I think with this, it's definitely have that roundtable discussion, because you'll be surprised what you already have internally to create this resilience. And when in the event the water does go down for your facility, you know exactly what's required with your AWS supply. So really, it's, you know, having dual power isn't enough for the cooling water, for the healthcare. Downtime isn't productivity loss, it's patient safety. Food and beverage, volume doesn't protect the brand integrity, water quality validation does. And energy and district energy, chemistry beats volume. The wrong water in an emergency will cause a 6-figure damage. And we've seen this happen with our clients. And with the hospitality, we know that no water is instant closure, and our reputation lingers long after. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Macmillan, for that. I didn't realize that the restart time and costs would be harder on companies than the outage. So thanks for sharing that. Also, didn't occur to me that companies don't realize that the water quality they're getting might not be what they need for their systems, or even knowing how to connect to a tanker. That's craziness. So absolutely, I think feels like planning is the key here. So we'll open up to questions. If there's any more questions, do put them in the questions tab in the tool. There were a few that came in. I'll start with those from the audience. So the first audience question, I think, was directed at Liz. The water efficiency dashboards seem to resonate. How geographically precise do those get? If I was a company wanted to get in, then how much detail could I get on how risky my area is?
Yeah, so the dashboards I showed on the slide are publicly available on the MOSL website. There's a dashboard and a map showing that data. So I guess for if you go to the map, you can actually type in a specific location on the search bar and get to the area of interest. The granularity of the risk goes down to water resource zone. So it's kind of the water resource zone that your point of interest is located within. But I do want to caveat, the data shown is the baseline position of the risk. So it's before the water industry implements its plans. So it's the kind of initial risk position of water scarcity or water deficits before mitigation action is taken by the water industry.
Thanks, Liz. Chris, there was a question that came in, was directed to you. Maybe it's a bit of a trivia question. We'll see if you could answer it. The question really was curious, what was the biggest kind of water supply interruption that you can recall in the UK? And I guess my follow-on to that was Water Direct involved? How bad has it gotten?
Yeah, so look, I'm going to give a half answer to this one. The trivia is not as good as I wish it would be. But the biggest simultaneous event that we ever saw was Beast from the East in 2018. So we had 10 different utility customers that had active incidents that we were managing for them simultaneously. I can't even pretend to imagine what the number of households that are affected by that. But in terms of simultaneous impact across, the biggest geography was Beast from the East. Is it increasing? Yes, we are seeing. What we are seeing is the frequency, but more worryingly is the scale of interruptions. Mm-hmm. So in the last year alone, we've had 2 instances where we have had supply interruptions that affected over 100,000 people, which, historically, aside from the Beast and the East, would be, we'd see one every few years, and they wouldn't even reach up to that level. So we're really seeing, both the frequency, but more concerningly, the impact of those supply interruptions.
Thanks, Chris. I think that was a good answer. I think you satisfied the trivia there. There was another question that came in, maybe not directly related, but we talked about it, or I mentioned it. Waterways pollution. Question was, is there a requirement for companies to document routes that waterways take through their land in order to efficiently respond and contain any contaminants? Again, this is all about planning for sites, not about water supply, but about kind of effluent that goes on. I can say that from my own knowledge, working with the industry and understanding trade effluent, water companies do take the trade effluent plans very seriously. And yes, some of them do require you to kind of map where those water flows are. If the water company is at all kind of responsible for a lackluster attention to trade effluent getting in the water, they will be severely fined through the EA. So there's certainly rules. But on a kind of related note to that, to what we talked about today, there were a few mentions of boreholes. That's a cool alternative to finding water, but that is not super easy either. That requires rules and regulations as well. You can't just sink a borehole and great, I'll take water out. Millie, anything you want to say on kind of rules and regs around boreholes?
Yes, of course. There is a limit of water that you can take out, but the capex of doing borehole surveys and then actually implementing a bore with suitable treatment equipment, many of our sites do review this, but the actual capex of this is just not within budget, and it could take 2 to 3 years. But then also dependent on where their site is located, the volume of water that they can extract per day. So it's not the silver bullet. You can explore this, and if you are fortunate enough to have your production facility in a suitable area where you can take maybe 20 or 30 meters cubed of water with minimal treatment, that's perfect. But this is not the case all the time, and it's the capex of it. Some companies can just not afford it, and it may take 3 to 4 years of savings to then implement this.
Yeah, it's just madness, though, I think, to have a large site and not know that you can or can't take water, or not know that you can or can't let water go into water. I think it's important. It's this planning that we've heard, and it just sounds like some businesses are not necessarily aware of what their kind of water responsibilities and privileges might be. So do plan. There are some other questions as well that I had over the presentation. I wonder if I could put them out there. Are there any warning signs that a business might be vulnerable to water supply interruptions, even if they haven't experienced one? I wonder if Chris or Miller might be best to place. Like, what are those early warning signs?
Yeah, look, I think the simple answer to that one is that if you ask somebody within your operation, what would you do if the water turned off, and you get a blanket expression, and there isn't that immediate kind of response of this is what we do, or even this is where the plan is located. That's the immediate point that I would go to.
Okay. So would you recommend that anybody who's listening to this tomorrow in their kind of team stand-up goes, what's our emergency water plan, and just look for blank expressions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah, agree. And I think water resilience, it should be sitting side by side with power, cyber, supply chain as part of your risk register. If you're not reviewing this, you are vulnerable. And then the cost of this could be 10 times more to fix. And this is what we see in industry.
Okay, a follow on to that. I think Chris and Millie, you both mentioned this doesn't have to be expensive. What is a good first step where resources are limited for companies to take to make sure they've got kind of better water resilience? Like, if I wanted to go, what's the absolute kind of most cost effective thing I can do to start if I have absolutely nothing planned?
Yeah, I think from my point of view is to measure. Measure twice, cut once. Just don't spend immediately, but map out your critical processes. And it's very important. All organizations need to understand the minimum viable flow of water for their production, for the hospital. That is key. But then also the type of quality, it's safe and compliant, but it doesn't cost a huge amount, but it's that round table discussion with everyone within that business to identify what the next steps are and what the budget would be to implement AWS as required.
Yeah, I'd echo that. You know, my answer is going to be very similar in the sense of understanding your network and understanding the consequences of failure. You know, think of it more from a strategic perspective. Whilst you've got the benefit of not being under pressure, I think is by far the first step that you need to take. Ultimately, you know, you look at the golden hour when an incident happens, and how you control that or how you put mitigation in for your own business. The amount of that you can save and start to get action in place if you understand your needs. Even if you haven't got anything in place, even if you haven't gone down the route, you know, you haven't gone to get the capex for the preemptive things that you can have in place, having a conversation with, like, say, Water Direct is a lot easier if you know exactly where you need, you know, what you need, where you need it, how it needs to work. If you can articulate that very clearly, very quickly, all of a sudden you saved a few hours on your response time and a few hours of people standing around site scratching their heads.
Thanks for that. Liz, maybe one for you. MOSL works very closely with Ofwat, works very closely with DEFRA. Are there any kind of regulatory or compliance developments on the horizon that will either kind of restrict water or make planning for emergencies more of a requirement? Is there anything that we need to be mindful of?
In terms of the kind of the water restrictions, I guess the water scarcity, there's a lot of focus on demand reduction, and currently that obligation is with the wholesalers. So there's a target to reduce non-household demand by 9% by 2038. But I think increasingly as this kind of date gets closer, there will be kind of increasing scrutiny on the kind of end customers to certainly reduce any wastage or make sure that they're sort of putting in place actions to help kind of everyone get to that target. As I said, to kind of improve the kind of ability to create headroom for this extra growth that's required. So yeah, while there's not at the moment, I think potentially going forward there might be increased scrutiny with sector benchmarking and, you know, that those kind of things, reporting more actively on kind of business usage.
Thanks, Liz. We're approaching 1 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap it up. I really appreciated the speakers today. I think it was really helpful, Liz, that you started with kind of a macro view on kind of what the risks are to the sector. I really like those maps. They're very interesting. Chris, thank you for telling us about what the impacts to kind of businesses can be and that there are strategies we can take. And Miller, I would imagine there are some kind of even more specific horror stories behind some of that lack of preparedness. And I wonder if people wanted to reach out for advice, you could probably share some kind of watch outs for them. So hopefully, if anybody has any questions for any of our speakers, they'll be ready and willing to speak to you. So the slide here has some helpful links that you might want to use. The hosting platform today, courtesy of Water Direct, will allow this presentation to be shared out. Water Direct will reach out if you have any other questions. They'll be happy to field those for you. Get in touch with the speakers. I hope that this is interesting enough. You might want to hear again from the speakers. I think this is a really important topic. I hope we have another webinar like this, and I hope that some of the attendees may want to take part in kind of a wider discussion about how we get this industry more prepared for kind of emergency interruptions and kind of alternative water supplies. Super important topic. So that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar, and bye for now.